Breath of the Wild is set in the ruins of a world broken by a single cataclysmic event, the return of the beast known only as the Calamity Ganon. Aside from Link's recoverable memories, the story of what actually happened on the day Hyrule fell must be pieced together by the ruins which litter the world, and the dialogue of those who remember. Until now, it seems. As Nintendo have been doing recently, they just dropped a trailer straight out of the blue for a game titled Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity, a new entry in the Hyrule Warriors series which tells the story of the return of Ganon, including huge battles with Hylian soldiers and hordes of minions, playable champions, and perhaps new story details. We don't yet know whether or not this game will be considered canon. There's a few details in this trailer that make me think that perhaps a lot of it won't be, but according to Yosuke Hayase, the game's producer, the game was developed after Eiji Aonuma himself approached the team, wanting a game to tell the story of the Great Calamity, and unlike the previous Hyrule Warriors games, Age of Calamity has been developed closely with the Zelda team, who helped with gameplay, graphics, world, and all dialogue. During the trailer, we see distinct gameplay clips and cutscenes, so we're definitely getting some incredible new story details taking place during the Great Calamity. So let's have a closer look at this trailer. Of course, it's only been a few hours since this trailer dropped, so treat this as a first analysis. If there's anything that I missed, I'll be sure to cover it later on in more detail. Without further ado, let's get into it. The trailer begins with an alternate version of Impa's cutscene from Breath of the Wild, showing us the famous tapestry which depicts a battle against the Calamity Ganon 10,000 years in the past, when it was successfully sealed by a hero, a princess, and the powerful Sheikah machines. We then see shots of guardians swarming Hyrule Castletown, which we do see in the main game, though these shots are from Age of Calamity rather than reused from Breath of the Wild, and as such we get some new angles of the disaster. Impa's voice, which played over this footage, ends, and we hear King Rome's voice with his famous line,
"I think you are now ready to hear what happened 100 years ago."
As he speaks, a familiar shot of Hyrule Castle, swarmed with malice after the Calamity, fades into a shot of the Citadel before the Cataclysm, the castle in all its glory. We then see Link, wearing soldier's armor and holding a knight's broadsword into the air, and we can see multiple other people surrounding him, which we'll come back to later, before we get a shot of Princess Zelda walking through the halls of Hyrule Castle. The lighting changes as she walks, suggesting she's walking outdoors, and she looks up at the very end of the shot. Perhaps she's walking out onto an observation platform to overlook a group of soldiers, which is a shot we'll see later on. Next up, we get a shot of the Sacred Grounds, which is where Link was appointed Zelda's personal knight. But then, the camera pans out into Hyrule Field, where we see a group of Hylian soldiers, complete with cannons on the side, engaging in combat against a horde of red bokoblins, with Link at the forefront, slicing through the monsters in typical Warriors fashion. After an explosion, Link runs up to face a moblin one-on-one, who roars and then we cut. The attention to detail here is great. These small pillars actually exist as ruins in the game, though there's a lot more further away like walls and towers which don't, most likely completely annihilated during the Calamity. It's safe to say that this is somewhere early on in the game, taking place after the shot with Link with the knight's broadsword, probably during one of the first battles in the game. Next, we have Zelda, holding the Sheikah Slate, which she did have before the Great Calamity, walking with Mipha, with Link visible in the background. We can also tell from the blue cliff just behind them that this shot takes place somewhere near Zora's domain. Here we have Link and Revali evidently having a sort of spar. As Link attempts a horizontal strike, the Rito pulls an insane move, flying over the Hylian with an arrow in one hand and his great eagle bow in another, knocking the arrow while upside down and aiming at the back of Link's head. From the background we can tell that this is at the flight range. Another interesting detail is that his great eagle bow lacks the blue sash, as does he himself, meaning that it's likely that he hasn't been appointed champion by Zelda yet, which is interesting and means this scene takes place quite a while before the Great Calamity occurs. Link and Revali have an incredibly competitive relationship, with Revali believing himself to be the superior warrior, so a spar between the two makes sense. Following this, we see a group of enemies, Bokoblins, Moblins and Lizalfos, marching through Hyrule Field, very near to the sacred grounds in which we saw the earlier battle, and most likely the first battleground in the game. Link takes on a group of blue Bokoblins, still clad in the soldier's armour, showing off a move in which he throws a bomb rune and then detonates it. He doesn't have the Sheikah Slate here, but it's great that he can still use runes without it in this game, though this is something that makes me think that not everything in this game will be canon. As the bomb explodes, it's notable that the Bokoblin's base visibly takes damage and begins to fall, meaning that we'll likely be able to destroy these in their entirety in Age of Calamity, rather than climb up them. They could function as keeps, too, where opposing armies fight over their control. Here's the shot of the soldiers in the courtyard I mentioned might follow from the shot of Zelda. We see a huge amount of Hylian soldiers stood in ranks, with King Rhoam standing above them, likely giving orders. I can't see Link among them, but judging from the earlier shot of him holding the knight's broadsword in the air, it wouldn't surprise me if he was here, perhaps in the front rank, obscured by Rhoam. The next shot of Hyrule Castle, engulfed in the Calamity's storm, has a little extra detail. At the very beginning, we can see Princess Zelda, Link and a Sheikah, who we'll come back to later. This is followed by a shot of Zelda, looking pretty horrified, staring out into the distance. She's probably looking at what we see next, guardians emerging from the pillars which surround Hyrule Castle. These pillars weren't present until Ganon re-emerged, despite how much Princess Zelda and the Sheikah researchers looked for them. These pillars store guardians, and it's cool to see the guardians actually emerging from the glowing spots, which we never see happen in Breath of the Wild. In fact, they even emerge spinning like a corkscrew, which is what was originally intended for the main game as seen in this concept artwork. It's brilliant to see this idea fully realised now that we're getting a closer look at the Calamity. Following this, we have a shot in Hyrule Castle's throne room, with King Rhoam standing on a platform, speaking evidently to Princess Zelda. Just behind her, Link and a Sheikah individual are kneeling, almost definitely the same Sheikah we saw earlier on in the trailer. This time though, we get a better look at the character, who wears a hat, not unlike those worn by some ancient monks. However, I reckon this character is Impa, who we see years later in Breath of the Wild, as an elderly woman. Creating a champion suggests she's around 120 years old in Breath of the Wild, meaning here she'd be around 20, so I'd be surprised if we didn't get to fight as her during this game. Though this scene features the same three characters as the shot outside of Hyrule Castle, it's unlikely that they take place near each other in the plot, as not only is Link wearing the soldier's armour here, but obviously the castle isn't yet under siege by Ganon. Another thing to note here is what can be seen just past Impa, a small white ball with a gold ring on it. Keep this in mind, we'll revisit this later. Here's a volley of cannon fire. At first I thought this could be Akkala Citadel, the site of a crushing defeat during the Calamity, which is the only place in Hyrule cannons can be found in the present day. However, we saw cannons earlier on in the trailer in Hyrule Field, and coupled with the stone structure behind it, it's likely that these cannons are in the same place. Next up, a particularly harrowing shot of Stal creatures rising from the earth, stood in the burned ruins of a village. The lighting suggests that there's a fire just behind the camera, and the sky is dark, which makes sense, as Stal creatures of course animate at night. Next, we get some really cool shots of the game's combat and playable characters. This has to be one of my favourite shots in the trailer. A red-maned Lionel readies itself and roars in its classic pose, then leaps towards Zelda, who uses the Sheikah Slate at the last second to freeze the beast in time using stasis. Following this, we see Mipha channel a jet of water, taking her high into the air, from which she vaults into a spinning dive towards the eye of a guardian, piercing the weak spot with her spear, which sends the machine flying backwards. Another exceptionally cool one here, Urbosa perfect dodges the swing of a Yiga Blade Master, spinning round to strike it with her famous Scimitar of the Seven. It's incredible to see Gerudo Town swarmed with the Yiga. This battle takes place right in the very centre of the settlement. The Yiga clan of course reside in the desert, and in Breath of the Wild are closely linked with the Gerudo storyline, so it makes sense for this battle to take place here. Next is a shot of all 5 champions. There's not much going on, but they all look pretty determined, and it's always great to see them all together. From the background, I'd guess that this is somewhere around Death Mountain, though it's impossible to know for sure. Speaking of the champions, here's one in action. Divine Beast Rudania walks, notably lit up by pure blue lights as opposed to the burning pink of Ganon's malice. This means that it's Daruk himself piloting this beast, and judging by the fact that we can see leafy trees and a small enemy outpost below it, an exciting possibility is that this shot doesn't take place on Death Mountain, where you'd expect Varudania to be. Perhaps the Divine Beasts won't be limited to their respective areas in this game, and will be free to fight in the war against Ganon up until the moment they're corrupted. We've seen a couple of shots so far at Zora's domain, and here's another one, with Zora soldiers taking on a small group of enemies. The shot ends in quite a brutal way, with the Zora soldier getting smacked with a Boko bat. We know from Breath of the Wild that the Zora were one of the few races to successfully repel Ganon's assault, with King Darifan himself actually taking on a Guardian single-handedly, so it's interesting to see battles take place here in Age of Calamity. So far we've seen gameplay clips of all but 2 champions. So here's Daruk, taking on a Hinox, one of the biggest, toughest enemies in the main game. The Goron champion swings his boulder breaker at the earth, causing pillars of molten rock to rise and strike the beast, and even though this doesn't kill the Hinox, who smashes them apart, Daruk still turns to pull a goofy pose towards the camera, and people still somehow argue that he's not the best champion. What's even more awesome about this clip is that Daruk is fighting this Hinox at Akala Citadel, where we know that Hylian soldiers suffered a defeat to the Guardian army. This confirms that this fortress is a location in this game, meaning we'll almost definitely see a lot more of it. And here's the final champion in combat, Revali taking on a horde of black bokoblins, of course using his Great Eagle Bow. While in the game the Great Eagle Bow shoots 3 arrows per shot, here Revali shoots 6, followed up with what looks like a fire or bomb arrow causing an explosion. Now, this shot here is a weird one, and one I can't quite explain. It's obvious that we have Link, in the champion's tunic, wielding the Master Sword and what looks like the Hylian Shield too, defending against what looks like a Thunder Spear. Bolts of electricity sparks from the weapon, and Link clearly struggles to defend against it, but who he's fighting and what's actually going on here is unclear. The next 4 shots are important. First we see Urbosa falling to one knee, then Mipha holding her spear and gasping in shock. Next, Daruk struggles against some sort of fire, and finally Revali is struck by a pink energy blast. These 4 shots tell a tragic story. They're the fall of each champion, succumbing to the blight within their divine beasts. Of course, Breath of the Wild tells us that during the Great Calamity, Ganon sent missiles of malice to each beast, forming the Blight Ganons, extensions of himself which assaulted the champions. Though they fought valiantly, each champion fell to the blights, and the divine beasts became poisoned. We can see from the green strip on the floor that Urbosa is within Varnaboris, and even though Mipha's shot is less clear, we can see the stone-like walls of Varuta behind her. The same's true for Daruk's shot, where we can see not only the stone roof of Varudania underneath him, but also the flaming greatsword of Fireblight Ganon. Daruk is using his signature ability, Daruk's Protection here, but as we know, he doesn't survive this. Revali's shot has no immediate clues as to where it is, but that's because Windblight Ganon was fought above Var Meadow. Interestingly, the Blight in-game fires with blue lasers while these are purple, though perhaps it's just a visual change to better represent malice. This shot features Link and Zelda, Zelda in her white dress and Link in his champion's tunic, though this time we can see for sure that he has the Hylian Shield, which he didn't during the Great Calamity as told during Breath of the Wild. The duo's attire confirms that this is towards the end of the Calamity, and thus probably the end of Age of Calamity, as this is what they wore when Link fell and Zelda's powers awakened near Fort Hateno. Behind the two we can see the gates of Hyrule Castle, and behind these Hyrule Castle town itself, which hasn't yet been burned to ash completely by Guardians, though a beam does come from behind the duo and hit the wall, causing them to turn in surprise. The penultimate scene is an incredible shot of the Calamity looming above Hyrule Castle, roaring in front of the Blood Moon. At the very beginning of this shot we can see Castletown again is not yet fully ruined, though it is soaked in malice. And finally, after the game's title appears, we get a small shot of Princess Zelda, wearing her white dress and holding out her hand. She's surrounded by sacred energy, the same energy which appears as her powers awaken near Fort Hateno in the main game. However, judging from the background, which shows some sort of stone, this isn't that same scene. I feel like I recognise the background too, but I just can't place it. In addition to the main trailer, there's a slew of screenshots, such as this shot of Zelda using the Magnesis rune to smack a group of enemies with a metal box, using stasis on a group of Lizalfos just outside of a skull encampment, or even throwing a volley of bombs at some blue bokoblins, both cubic and spherical. However, what's really interesting in this last screenshot is that it takes place in a Hylian town, which we see almost exclusively only as ruins by the time of Breath of the Wild. I tried to map this to a location in Breath of the Wild's world, using the well as a reference, but I couldn't see where it fits. But regardless, seeing villages before they burn to ash is something I've wanted for years. We can also see Link taking on a corrupted Guardian, notably using an ancient arrow, outside of what appears to be a bokoblin camp, which is far more fortified than those we see in Breath of the Wild. It's most likely the same area in which we saw Mipha take on a Guardian, just outside of a keep. There's also the hero fighting a group of Lizalfos, accompanied by an Ice Wizrobe, again using the same weapon. Here we have a screenshot of Link performing his spin attack on a group of enemies, but notably we can see in the background that this game will use dithering for distant enemies, whereas Breath of the Wild would simply have characters pop in when within draw distance. There's also a screenshot of the Hyrule Field battle we saw earlier, again which I think is the first battleground in the game, not only featuring Link alongside the group of Hylian soldiers, but the Temple of Time and the Great Plateau in the background too. As I mentioned earlier, these pillars exist in Breath of the Wild as ruins, though the larger structures don't, likely ruined during the Calamity entirely. The final piece to analyse is the main artwork. A jaw-droppingly gorgeous piece featuring all champions, including Zelda herself, posed amongst flames of malice. Zelda is using her sacred power here, just like we saw at the very end of the trailer. In the background on the left, we can see a legion of guardians, and on the right, basic enemies, like moblins, bokoblins, and a Hinox. Even further back, we have of course Hyrule Castle, and to its right, Divine Beast Noboris, surrounded by Guardian Skywatchers. This could very easily just be for the poster's sake, but if it's true that Varudania isn't on Death Mountain during this shot, then perhaps we'll see Varnaboris outside of the Gerudo Desert, taking on legions of enemies, which would be incredibly cool to see. And, of course, in the forefront of the poster we have this little fella, a tiny white guardian on little tiny legs. It doesn't seem corrupted, not that it has any lights outside of its eye to judge by, and it seems to be fighting alongside the heroes. So who knows what role this little guy will play. If you remember the white sphere from back in the shot with Impa, it's clear that it's the same machine. So perhaps this device was built by Impa prior to the Calamity. Overall, even though I've not been a huge fan of Hyrule Warriors games in the past, I can't not be excited for Age of Calamity. A game taking place in one of the most important, badass, yet depressing periods of Hyrule's long history. Who knows if this Warriors title will end up being canon in Zelda lore or not, but regardless, it's a game where I can smash enemies around as Daruk, so I'm happy. What are your thoughts on Age of Calamity? Is there anything you think I missed? Let me know in the comments down below. Cheers guys, and I'll see you next time.